Hi everybody, my name is Michael Lavalette from the Social Work Action Network International Steering Committee, and with me today I've got three of our colleagues from Australia. It's a great pleasure to have Carolyn Noble, Christine Morley and Philip Ablett with us, all three the recent editors of the Routledge Handbook of Critical Pedagogies for Social Work. So first of all, welcome to each of you. Carolyn is Emeritus Professor of Social Work at the University of Victoria. And then Christine is Professor of Social Work at Queensland University of Technology. And Philip is in the Sociology team, I think I've got that right, at the University of the Sunshine Coast. Is that right, Philip? Have I got that wrong?
No, it's partly right, but I teach into social work and human services, primarily.
Okay.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it would be a sociology team of one.
Is that okay? So Philip, Christine and Caroline are going to talk to us a little bit about radical social work in Australia today. And we're going to start, I think, with Caroline. And who's Caroline? I think you're going to tell us a little bit about the... Oh, no, sorry, it's not. It's Philip. I've got this wrong already.
Right.
But it's Philip who's going to tell us a little bit about the history of radical social work in Australia. So, Philip, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. I thought you were going to let me off the hook then. Look, I think I'd just begin with just a few remarks about the history, I suppose, of colonial settler Australia, which is the context within which welfare services and social work, eventually the profession of social work, emerged. So it's a history of colonial settler expansionism, invasion, and Indigenous dispossession, and racial oppressions. So I think that's really important. And so it's derivative social work in Australia of the colonial settler movement, largely from Britain. Although there were contextual things because it was a penal colony that made it different from the home country. The poor laws couldn't apply in the form they did in Britain because everyone was starving when they landed, and so there was always a role for the government in the commissariat, keeping the people alive. The first social services were provided by, well, very ad hoc. There was a benevolent society, partly funded by the government. So, but there wasn't an established church. There wasn't the wealthy elite at first that would serve as beneficiaries for charitable organisations. There were churches and there were friendly societies later on, from when working class people began to organise and form trade unions. That happened later. White working class people in the 19th century. The depredations of colonial capitalism in the 19th century, they were real. I was going to say maybe not as severe as some of what occurred in Britain, largely because there was a labour shortage in the white population, and that gave early organised labour a stronger bargaining hand, and some early successes up until the 1880s in winning concessions and higher wages. Depression struck in the 1890s, though, and that changed all that. You had the defeat of the strikes, foundation of a Labour Party. And in the 1890s, in the Depression, there were abortive attempts to establish the COS, the charitable organisation. Society had a bridgehead in Melbourne, but its liberalism was self-defeating because it didn't believe it was all about self-help and a liberal individual self-determination. But then that was contradicted when they had to go to London, cap in hand, seeking assistance, seeking funds elsewhere. So the ironies. And there were already established organisations, as I said, like the Benevolent Society, that did get some state support. Now, there was very little influence from the other tradition of settlement houses that occurred in Britain in Toynbee Hall and the Jane Addams style of Hull House in the United States. There was one exception to that, that would have been in Sydney, where some former Toynbee residents founded a settlement house in Darlington, near today's Redfern in Sydney. And the house is still there. It's a community centre now. And the Sydney Women's Union and the Toynbee residents and a number of women activists, leading women activists of the time, pushed very strongly for the creation of the first professional course in social work at the University of Sydney. Everywhere else, in all the other, it was very state-based. Australia began as a colonial settler society with 6 colonies. In the other colonies that became states of federation, social work began as hospital almoning, almost exclusively, with the partial exception of Sydney, where, you know, perhaps there was some more progressive ideas of treating the poor as equals and extending various forms of public services and so on. There were some important figures. There were reformers at that time, analogous, I suppose, to the Jane Addams and the founders of social work elsewhere, but a lot of them worked outside of social work. I mean, an exception, partial exception, was a woman named Norma Parker, who was a member of the National Council of Women. That was the peak women's organisation between the wars. And she was also the founding president of the Australian Association of Social Work. And I think she was the founding president of ACOS, the Australian Council of Social Services too. She came from a conservative, but the Catholic social justice background as it manifested in Australia. So that's a bit like the prehistory of radical social work. But I suppose the real breakthrough, the real recognisably radical social work was in the 1970s. It had to wait till the 1970s in Australia, where there was resurgent activism generally around many issues. Australia had had a conservative government for 23 years at the federal level, and you had the Vietnam War. Australia was there with the United States, so the anti-Vietnam War movement was peaking, and people were on the streets. You had the election of the first Labor government, the Whitlam Social Democratic government in 1972, as I said, for the first time in 2 decades. And that provided opportunities for social workers or progressive social workers, but it didn't last long, unfortunately. Whitlam was only there for 3 years, barely 3 years. Enormous amount of reform and change came as a result of that government. Recognition of China, free tertiary education, the establishment of a national health service equivalent. Within social work at that time, there were not only those who were invited to participate in Whitlam's project, there were people further to the left than that. There was a revival of interest in Marxist analysis, and Marx's influence at that time was significant on the left. There was the formation of a group of radical social workers, and Carolyn can probably speak to this more directly and authoritatively than I can, Inside Welfare, which was, I guess, the Australian equivalent of CaseCon in the UK. And there were social work academics and researchers, particularly at RMIT and the University of Queensland, amongst other institutions, who were writing the radical manifestos, radical analyses of poverty, calling for far stronger measures in social provision. intervention in areas where Australian governments had not been. There were outstanding figures in that period. Connie Benn at the Brotherhood of St Lawrence in Melbourne pioneered the only Australian experiment with a basic income through the Family Neighbourhood Project, 1973 to 75. I think that ran for about 3 years, where they paid 50 families a basic income that brought them just above the poverty line. And it was I think according to all the research that was done, a lot of it retrospective, a success. It showed that, people, when given a living income, don't waste their time, as the stereotypes would depict them. They get an education, they help others, and use that time very creatively and productively. It was mainly the women heads of the households who were the recipients of that. But after the 70s, there was unfortunately a real retreat. The Whitlam government was, overthrown, I suppose, in a sort of constitutional coup by the Governor-General, and subsequently Conservative governments were elected. So that moment, I suppose, closed, and there was a reaction against many of the welfare measures and progressive measures of the Whitlam era. And subsequent Labor governments were, in the view of many of us, never quite as progressive as the Whitlam one had promised to be. Social, but there's always been outstanding figures in social work and movements within social work in different areas. I mean, Marxist analysis, of course, was very strong on class issues and poverty, but was criticised by the feminists and the feminists within social work at the time, who brought in a stronger feminist analysis in the late 70s and into the 80s. So there are other progressive currents within social work, the anti-racist current as well, particularly in a colonial settler society. And some of those feminist social workers did amazing stuff. The founding of the Centres Against Sexual Assault in Melbourne, that was basically co-founded by a social worker who was one of a generation that, look, as I said, Carolyn can probably speak more directly of that generation because she was with them. She's one of them.
So Phil, thanks very much. That's an incredibly comprehensive introduction to Australian life politics and where social work fits within that. I think that'd be really useful for people looking from the outside. And you raised a number of issues that we'll maybe come back to. So you start off talking about the sort of racialised nature of social work, and maybe, Carolyn, when we're talking about horrible histories, we'll touch on some of those aspects, and we'll think about the various things that social work has done in terms of its horrible histories as well. But Christine, you're going to just maybe give us some examples of, or bring that up to date story, and think about some elements of a more radical progressive practice in Australia today. And I think you've got some examples of good or collective forms of practice to talk through.
Yeah, well, I particularly wanted to talk about education, Michael, and, because we've just written a book on critical pedagogies, because we believe that critical social work education can really make a difference in shaping whether or not activism is seen as vital and fundamental for social work, or whether it's not. We see activism as absolutely vital in challenging prevailing power structures, and for social work to indeed meet its internationally espoused goals of social justice and human rights, the liberation of people. How do we do that if we're not advocating, if we're not engaging in social action, and so on? And we believe it's arguably amongst the most important strategies needed to develop resistance to contemporary social problems, such as a lack of action on climate change, on wealth inequality producing measures that continue to pervade social policy in Australia and other places, the continued misogyny that we're seeing in our political systems. That's a massive issue for us in Australia at the moment, with the number of sexual assaults being reported from Parliament, and the racism that continues to pervade Australian society and our structures and institutions. So our firm belief, you know, in terms of providing some hope as a way forward, is that students, you know, social work education can play a vital role if students have a foundation in critical theory and its application to social work practice to become critical practitioners, not just neoliberal functionaries who are carrying out technical practice, but those who are prepared to organise and prepared to engage in political forms of practice, including activism. Critical pedagogy, we see, is really central to this. In Stephen Brookfield's words, critical pedagogy is grounded in an activist desire to fight oppression, to fight injustice and bigotry, and create a fairer, more compassionate world. And we see that that's really the purpose of social work and the purpose of social work education. And fundamentally, it connects students with a learning that is transformative. So not just something that where they get more skills or that they just kind of top up their knowledge base. This is about fundamentally challenging and changing a worldview to think beyond hegemonic ideas and to think beyond and outside the square, to have more independent and critical thinking capacity. So essentially learning that helps students make the connections between the personal and political, learning that highlights the importance of a critical analysis of society and also the importance of critical self-reflection. Basically preparing the skills, students with skills to exercise democratic agency, including activism. So we've tested this, I've tested this at a couple of different institutions, and at the last university I was at, which, you know, where Philip is still employed, there was an activist group of sorts that Philip set up actually with social science students called Agents of Change. And when social work was introduced there, and we particularly introduced with intention a critical social work program, you know, another kind of activist group formed, and they formed independently of staff really, and they organised about 40 different activist events over a 2-year period. They were very active, and this is at a time where activism is declining, where, you know, most universities are talking about students not being engaged in campus life and wanting to do online and distance stuff. Like, these students were on campus and they were mobilised and they were impactful, and causing a few problems for the university too, in terms of, you know, holding them accountable really about the lack of disabled car parking spaces, the lack of services. Yeah, the lack of services. There had been a sexual assault on campus, and they went to the media about getting appropriate lighting and security for women on campus. So, you know, that embarrassed the university and made some waves, but we just saw it as amazing and wanted to understand it more. So they called themselves the Swans as well, and they were inspired by your group in the UK. They had 2 A's in their name, so they were the Social Work Action and Advocacy Network. And they did the work that they did really was amazing. It was inspiring and it was contagious. The group just grew, and they were very successful. And they took action on a whole range of different social justice issues that were topical at the time. They also joined with a heap of different other, you know, campaigns that were happening. I've got some video footage they produced that I can leave you with at the end of this interview if there's time. But, you know, I guess what I wanted to talk about in this interview is we did some research to see whether the Swans felt that there was a connection between social work education that they'd been exposed to, the critical nature of the social work education, and their activism. And their narratives, when we interviewed them, pretty much confirmed hands down that having a critical social work curriculum that included dedicated courses on critical social theory, included dedicated courses on community development and social action, political advocacy, critical self-reflection and anti-racism, politicise them and conscientise them in ways that move them to engage in activism, to take a stand against human rights abuses, and to find ways to make a difference for a more democratic and socially just world. So I think, you know, social work education has a really important role to play in building a community of activist learners and educators in the classroom with tangible and meaningful opportunities. And I think staff can really support that in what they're doing. And I want to just share my screen with you for a minute to just take some of the quotes and just... So this, this is a quote from one of the people that we interviewed, just saying, as soon as I started to engage with this learning and the links between the personal and political, I started to become an activist. I realised the significance of people coming together, collectivising over social issues. So I started to go to protests. I definitely became more politically engaged as a direct result of this education. And we were just really thrilled with that outcome, because we had hoped that that is what it would result in, and it did, and it was highly successful. This person also states, I now see activism as a fundamental part of my social work practice. I see it as a responsibility. I didn't think that before my degree. So these were people who weren't necessarily politicised, didn't see activism as part of what they would do as social work. They came in maybe with a case management view of, or a therapeutic view about, kind of fixing individuals, and became a whole lot more political. And then when I moved to Queensland University of Technology, I started to miss the activist culture, and they didn't have necessarily the same explicit commitment to critical theory, although there were some staff there doing that kind of work. And they were a bit dismayed that their student body weren't engaging in activism. They hadn't seen that. And so we decided to ramp up the curriculum and make that a whole lot more politically progressive, and a lot more explicitly critical, and built in community development and organising and things like that. And it again, it had the same practice, the same impact. So, this is us marching together, and staff and students are engaged in these activities together to normalise it, to support students in engaging in activism. So the National Tertiary Education Union and the National Union of Students in 2017 marched against the deregulation of fees, but QUT staff and students now regularly engage in activism to support the voices of marginalised groups, and to protest against injustice and to support progressive social change. So some other examples include like our action on climate change, which was it 2019, given that we lost a year last year with COVID. So, staff, again, from social work and human services marched with students from the School of Public Health and Social Work. We gathered in Brisbane on the 20th of September to participate in the rally to march towards, to place political pressure on our governments to take action on climate change. So there's been a number of different issues, like whether we're picking up on Islamophobia or other climate issues. Students and staff now see it as a core responsibility of their role. It's part of what we do as social workers. It's really normalised, it's expected, and essentially a fundamental part of social work practice. The most recent event was the March for Justice, which people engaged in last Monday. So you can see here, the pictures of students gathering together at QUT and preparing placards and talking about the importance of this march, which coincided with International Women's Day, to highlight the importance of gender equity and inequities that are existing, and to protest patriarchy and sexism and the consequent violence and discrimination that women in politics are experiencing, given the alarming kind of stories that are emerging from Australian Parliament at the moment. And I've got, I don't think that will work, but I've got this other, I'm just going to escape here and see if I can find it. Just a little excerpt. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah, we see them marching.
Okay. Is it white? I don't know why it's not playing.
Press there.
I'm pressing. I'll go back here. Help me make it work.
We've got the idea, I think.
Yeah.
Got the idea. I wanted to give you the grab. It's only like 10 seconds, but maybe it's a bridge too far.
Give us the punchline.
That is the punch. This is the punchline. I don't want to not have it, but I don't know why it's not working. Let's see. I reload it. Oh, me and technology. The best laid plans.
Okay. But going to try one more. And then, oh, there we are.
This was prepared by one of our students, Riley Griffith, who's put this TikTok video together. This is actually Associate Professor Heather Fraser, who's one of our colleagues at QUT, who managed to find herself on Channel 9. So that's it. That's it from me, but I just wanted to show you what our students have been up to, because they've been amazing. And again, they followed through with creating these kind of videos, and they see that as a really fundamental part of the social work education and their practice.
So thanks very much, Christine. And obviously, you know, so far what we've had from the history of radical social work, some of the contemporary projects, and I suppose at heart what in Swan we would look at is the contested nature of social work and the importance obviously of the engaged activist social work in contrast to other types of social work. And I suppose one of our arguments would be that if we don't engage, then what can easily happen is that social work ends up engaging in things that we might call horrible histories, so doing things that are inappropriate. And I know that Carolyn's going to talk a little bit about that just now. So Carolyn.
Yes, we'll have to come back to Christine after I finish my little talk, because it is kind of depressing. And I think just to add to what Philip was saying, that social work, radical social work developed in tangent to the social movements. It was never central to the social movements, but certainly linked into all the social movements. And as Christine is pointing out now, the current social movements are still vivid examples of activist social work we can use in the classroom. And I was saying to my friend Linda Briskin today when I was talking about this talk, I said, you know, if I wasn't an academic, I wouldn't have stayed in social work. I think because social work education and social work scholarship has been the most open access for progressive ideas in social work. We have actually, I think, excelled in the number of our books and our scholarship and our research highlighting and promoting activist and progressive work. However, practice has lagged behind considerably. And one of the examples that I want to give over the last 100 years is the way in which social workers who are employed by these organizations have in actual fact remained silent when these things have occurred. So I've got 5 examples of children being removed from their homes for various reasons and in various decades over the context, and I will be writing this up in Vasilis' book as well. But first, since colonisation, Aboriginal and Torres Strait child and children have been taken systematically from their homes and put into government and religious run institutions. Almost to the late 1970s and the 1980s, it was still going on. And in many cases now, these children are no longer taken from home, but incarcerated at a huge rate, because we don't know how to deal with the cultural tensions between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders families and their children, and the way in which the punitive social control actually wants to police them. So they're called stolen children, and the trauma of this generation still lives across and through the transgenerational impact on these communities. The second one was in 1920s and the 1970s. Over 10,000 British children were forcibly removed from Britain to regional areas in South Australia, in Western Australia, where they were abused as slave labour and as sexual and abused both in terms of economically and sexually. And although there's been some reconciliation with these families, with these children, most of them have remained separated from their families and still live here in Australia. In the 1970s, when I started my practice, and I was actually part of this, and this is where I have some guilt, was that almost 150,000 unwed mothers' babies were forcibly taken from them with forced adoptions. They were done against the law. This was done against the law, and it was done in many cases with social work facilitation. And the forced adoption was silent. There was very little records, and a lot of those records have been destroyed. So a lot of those mothers and babies are still separated. And the trauma for these women and children continues today. The next one is in the past several decades, particularly the last 2 decades, children have been detained in immigration detentions, often separated from their families, but even when they are with their families, they are being held in detention camps on islands separate from Australia, where their emotional and physiological impact has prolonged their deprivation of social and cultural and physical and emotional care. These children suffer even to this day. Even though they've been released from detention, they are still in community houses waiting for the rulings of the Immigration Department. And over 4 decades, I continue, over 4 decades, children in out-of-home care have suffered institutional sexual abuse for many, many decades. And it was just not just in government and religious-run organisations, but in ordinary community groups, in scout groups, in sporting groups, in schools. Tremendous numbers of children were sexually abused and continue to be sexually abused, giving cover for pedophile rings, into making them feel like they can operate with immunity. And of course, they've all left a trail of destruction and hurt and trauma through the generations. And this, I think, highlights some of the problems that social workers can't escape from, because, as I say, I mention all of this because these organisations and institutions are the primary employers of social workers. This is where most of the practitioners that we educate work. And this is where, if you like, they have been practicing both in the past and the present and the future. And it is our shame that these failings in human rights protections continue. And while the cloak of shame has been lifted from the survivors as they recount their stories, and as there has been some apologies and several commissions into exposing this, these practices have not been totally dealt with by the Australian Social Worker for Social Workers. And that these stories have not got the overdue recognition for the abuse and neglect they have endured. And it is to our shame that they experience these abuses at all. And I think that is just one example. You can see the examples in disability, in mental health, in criminal justice, the list of where social workers are located, and the consequences of inaction and invisibility in the public sphere of the activism that we teach them in the classroom is lacking. And as I said, I wouldn't stay in social work if I hadn't had the opportunity, I suppose, to be part of the radical resistance, the point where we can actually highlight and give voice from the safety of the institutions of academe, which is, until recently, had much more of a freedom of a voice. And so I think that, to our shame, we still don't have the sort of activism that translates into practice. Now, I don't want to say too much more about it, except that the more progressive, it's my view that the more progressive social work voice has been grounded down and drowned and trodden down by the relentlessness of the neoliberalism, and of course this return to right-wing conservatism and the populism that we actually are experiencing at the moment. And while we can name it and identify it, it's still needing a lot more critical action from us.
Thanks, Caroline. And I suppose then what we maybe come to a conclusion is that we can't stay silent. We don't have choices in these things. If we stay silent, then we collude with the oppression and the injustices that can take place in the name of social work. And in response to that, the alternative is an alternative of social work which is rooted in activism. And maybe on that point, if we go back to Christine, because you wanted to finish with a
I'd
clip.
like to leave you with this if you're prepared to risk technology on me one more time. So this is a more hopeful end where our students are wanting to contest injustice and they are organised to do that. So here's just something they've produced, which I find inspiring.
Push the arrow again.
Do I just wait?
No, because it's not on. You've got it. It's cool. There you go.
Here we go.
Okay. So this was about contesting the lack of car parking spaces. I didn't do anything. This was a visit to the local Indigenous community at Sherburn to engage in partnerships with Sherburn community. Nice quote from Linda Brisman. There's a lot done to support international students who didn't have a community. And marriage equality that hadn't been introduced in Australia at the time, which we were still campaigning for. A lot around refugees and marriage equality in particular. Blue Stocking Day for national education. And they had a constitution that they organised. It's a flat structure. Yeah.
Well, I think I'll still say a social worker.
I think there's still hope. They thought there was another
I think
world possible as well, and a
Yeah.
world to win, as Paul Michael Garrett would suggest.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Philip, Christine, Caroline, thanks very much for talking to us this morning and giving us that really thorough background into the positives and negatives of Australian social work and the roots and possibilities of a better and different social work. It's been great listening to you. Thanks very much.
And we wish
Thank
you
you,
great
Michael.
success for the conference. Yes. Good luck.